All right.
Aaron, sorry. Okay. Shall
Welcome
I
to the
just
Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled The Future of U.S. Saudi Relations. My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the
All
Executive
right.
Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and towards rigorous diplomacy. We favor a grand strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. And there's few places, few regions in the world that need more military restraint than the Middle East. And within the Middle East, the relationship the United States has had with Saudi Arabia has been one of the important factors that has moved the United States away from a posture of restraint. The Saudi-US relationship was built on a tacit quid pro quo of Saudi oil for American security guarantees. But over the course of the past decades, and perhaps the last two in particular, Saudi and American interests have increasingly diverged. The partnership has formally remained in place, all the while the underlying geopolitical justification for it has eroded. On the one hand, because the US is far less dependent on foreign oil, but also because the American public is increasingly turning against a very taxing American military presence in the Middle East. In that context, the context of a potential post-oil future and an increasingly multipolar regional order, should the United States review and revisit and rethink its relationship with Saudi Arabia? Would tough love between the US and Saudi Arabia help stabilize the region, or would it actually intensify regional rivalries and undermine US national interests? And how will Riyadh react to, and what are its options when it comes to what appears to be an almost inevitable American military drawdown from the Middle East? To address all of these issues, we have an excellent panel that will be moderated by Quincy Institute's own Dr. Anel Shiline, who has herself worked extensively on Saudi Arabia. As always, if you are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. And if you're watching this on YouTube, put your questions in the comment section and we will get to them as well. So without any further ado, please welcome Anel Shiline, who will introduce the panel and kick off the conversation. Anel?
Thanks so much, Trita, and thanks so much to our panelists for being here to talk about this topic, and to everyone joining us through Zoom and YouTube. So just quickly, I will introduce our panelists. We have Madawi Al-Rashid, who is a visiting professor at the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics, a former professor at King's College, and the author and editor of numerous books on Saudi Arabia, most recently Salman's Legacy, The Dilemmas of a New Era in Saudi Arabia. We also have Gregory Gause, who is a professor of international relations and the John H. Lindsay 44 Chair at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He also serves as the head of the International Affairs Department, and he's a frequent commentator on Gulf affairs. Finally, Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. For more than 2 decades, Miller served in the Department of State as a historian, analyst, negotiator, and advisor on Middle East issues to both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state. He is a CNN global affairs analyst and a frequent commentator on NPR, BBC, and Sirius XM radio. Thanks to all of our panelists for being with us today. Glad we're all able to be with us. So the first question I'll be asking is sort of a general question about the extent to which American and Saudi interests align. Given that the relationship has often seen as reflecting a tacit quid pro quo of Saudi oil for American security, to what extent, as the US has become less dependent on Persian Gulf oil, and simultaneously as actors like Russia and China are likely to increasingly compete with the US as a security guarantor, the US and Saudi special relationship may no longer make sense. This dynamic became especially apparent during the oil price war that began in March, where oil prices fell precipitously and harmed the interests of US shale producers. So just in general, moving forward into the 21st century, do US and Saudi interests still align the way they once did?
So I'm happy to go first. I think that there are a couple of things that we should keep in mind. And one is that I don't think the US-Saudi relationship was ever based on Saudi oil to the United States for American security. I think the American view of this was always that Saudi Arabian oil was important for the world economy. And because it was important for the world economy, it was important for our allies in Europe and Asia. The U.S. Saudi relationship had its foundations before the United States imported a single drop of oil from anywhere. We were exporting oil, right? And so I think that if we still think oil, and to me, this is the big question, right? Is oil still a strategic commodity, right? Not so much does the United States have to import any oil, but is oil still a strategic commodity? And if it is, then does the United States want to have some influence in an area that exports more oil than any others? And I think that that's an open question and worth debating. But I think we restrict it a little too much if we think in terms of just what are our American import needs in energy.
You know, I think Greg makes a really good point, and it's really worth discussing the issue, the oil factor here. You know, but Anil, I think the question begs another one, and that is, what are core American vital interests in the region? I spent more than 2 decades grappling with this question, and frankly, I was never satisfied with the answer. As I see it now, we have 3 vital interests. And when I say vital, I mean interests that an American president would be prepared to spend American lives if necessary, put Americans in harm's way, spend enormous amounts of resources and money, and expend, frankly, what we don't have a lot of these days, which is American credibility. One is protecting the homeland, which is the organizing principle of any nation's foreign policy. You can't protect the homeland, you don't need a foreign policy, frankly. Second is access to oil, not so much for our needs. I think Greg is absolutely right. We're weaning ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbons, but the rest of the world is not. So that will give the United States a clear, I would argue, still vital interest. And finally, this is arguable to some, is preventing the emergence of a regional hegemon. And I don't think there is one that can digest the region, but a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon. So the question is, do U.S. Saudi interests, if I'm correct in identifying those 3 core interests, do U.S. Saudi interests align along the lines of those 3 vital rather than discretionary interests? And I think a case can be made that increasingly they don't.
Well, if I may, I'm sorry I was a little bit late. There was a technical problem. But let me think of this question from the Saudi side. I think there is actually a certain fatigue that is emerging over the last sort of probably 2 decades. I think regardless of what the origins of the relationship and the justification for it that Greg mentioned, you know, the strategic location, oil is important even if the US is not consuming it, but it's important also to control US rivals in the global world who happen to be very dependent on Saudi and Gulf oil like China. But I think when you talk about your national interest from DC, it is not actually corresponding to what Saudis think of as their national interest. Yes, the homeland security of the US is important for any US administration, but we see that Saudi Arabia, by adopting certain policies in the past almost 40, 50 years, had actually represented a threat to American national security and the homeland security, and 9/11 is just a classic example of that. In terms of oil, yes, perhaps now it is more important to focus on oil, especially with the Chinese-US relations deteriorating, and China is adopting aggressive policies to secure that, not only in the Middle East, but in Africa and other places in the world. But in terms of a regional hegemon, I think the alignment, the partnership, I wouldn't even describe it as an alliance, this US-Saudi relationship. It's a partnership that is convenient, but it has become so old and suffered during different crises to the extent now that it is not really relevant. From the Saudi point of view, they see the US simply as a supporter of the regime, as the guarantor of the regime's survival, and as a source of weapon. In a way, I don't see that the current leadership in Saudi Arabia goes beyond that when it talks about the US.
That's a pretty
so much.
vital interest, though, Madhu.
Sorry, say that again.
I was only going to say that what you describe is a pretty remarkable degree of dependency. And it suggests that the Saudis, and I think the two of you may or may not agree, are far more dependent on the United States now than at any point in this 7-decade-old relationship. Whether we're making use of that fact, that leverage, is another question.
Yes, it's a great dependency because if there is any discussion of the US withdrawing from the region in the coming months, probably, that sends shockwaves in Saudi Arabia, because simply this is a regime that has no legitimacy within the country, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, that it has become extremely dependent on US support. I think the worry in Riyadh now is that any move by the US would actually unleash some serious troubles at home in Saudi Arabia, simply because the current leadership has failed to get the sort of consensus by which Saudi Arabia was ruled over the last 70, 80 years. And the more the US threatens to sort of, adopt a hands-off approach to Saudi Arabia, the more nervous the regime is in Riyadh.
I do think that the changes that have happened in Saudi Arabia at the political level are fascinating. I don't know if I'd buy into Madawi's notion that the regime is less secure right now, but that's an arguable point. But it's ironic that people, both in the regime and I think in the public in Saudi Arabia, think that the United States is able to sustain the regime. And I think what's been demonstrated from American policy in the past is we're not very good at sustaining regimes of our allies when they face serious domestic problems, whether it was the Shah of Iran or Hosni Mubarak in 2011. I think that what the United States is good at is protecting its allies from conventional attacks from abroad. And one can argue whether that's even relevant now.
That hasn't happened. Saudi cities had been bombed by the Houthis. The Saudis use American weapons to launch a war, and it has been going for 5 years. Plus, Iran has launched missile attacks on vital oil installations, and the US has failed to protect Saudi Arabia. So in a way, it is not straightforward. It's not a straightforward sort of equation that the US would protect Saudi Arabia from outside attack. It's been attacked over the last 5 years. Although it had all the support of the US and all the military equipment that the US weapons manufacturer could produce.
And Madawi, that's my point. that now, even that fundamental element of the security strategy is called into question. I think less by the Houthis, although the use of American weapons in Yemen is a very serious issue. But when the Iranians attacked Abqaiq and Khurais, these very important oil nodes, taking out half of Saudi oil production in September of last year, right? The one thing that the United States said it was in the Persian Gulf to do was protect the free flow of oil. And when that happened, which was probably the most serious attack on that principle of the free flow of oil since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States basically said, who cares?
You know, it's fascinating. Yeah. We've been in the conversation now for 15 minutes, and there's been no mention whatsoever of the two personalities that have essentially taken a traditional U.S. Saudi relationship and, in my judgment, driven it off the highway. I mean, what's occurred in the last 3 years is extraordinary, but by any standards. I've watched the U.S. Saudi relationship now studied it for a long time, the U.S. Saudi relationship. I defer to Madawi with respect to internal developments within Saudi Arabia. But it's remarkable what's happened. The emergence of Donald Trump and his conviction, and at least the 30-something-year-old that is playing a very influential role in American policy, made a judgment even before the inauguration that he was going to reorient American foreign policy along two poles which his predecessor had, in his view, disbanded. One is the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and the other is the relationship with Israel. And it's no coincidence that the President of the United States took his first foreign foray. His predecessors go to Canada, they go to Mexico, they go to Britain. This president took his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia and to Israel. And that has set the tone, it has set the character, even by traditional standards where the US has placated, acquiesced, sucked up to the Saudis for decades. Mr. Trump has set a new level of obeisance and acquiescence to Saudi Arabia. And he's done it at a time when the second actor, Mohammed bin Salman, the other 30-something that's shaping the U.S. Saudi relationship, has pursued a series of policies, from Yemen to the virtual hostage video with Rafiq Hariri, to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, to internal repression, which is at a new standard, even by Saudi standards, at home. And yet the administration has given the young prince, well, a get out of jail card for sure, but tremendous margin for maneuver. Now that may be changing to some degree because of the oil issue, but we can't talk about the US-Saudi relationship the way we used to talk about it, because you've got two personalities who are driving it in a very different direction.
So I think one question that has come up repeatedly from audience members relates to specifically this issue and the possibility of a deal in Palestine. So I know that this is something that Aaron, you have particular expertise in, if you want to address the extent to which the US, the so-called Trump plan, is something that Saudi leadership could ever support, or would that potentially further undermine Saudi legitimacy in the way that Dr. Al-Rashid has pointed out?
I'll only make three brief comments on this. I mean, the chances of a two-state solution, given the realities that exist on all sides of this conflict, are basically slim to none. And this Trump initiative is simply not ready for prime time. I'll only say that when I've had a series of meetings with Mr. Kushner during 2017 and 2018, and he made it unmistakably clear to me that he was going to create a strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia and marshal Saudi resources and leverage in order to do two things to promote Arab-Israeli peace. One, pressure the Palestinians to make concessions, and number two, to reach out to the Israelis. And the latter point, they have orchestrated, and they have built on a natural, narrow coincidence of interest between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which has created quite a remarkable set of contacts between the two. But on the former point, despite MBS's disregard of the Palestinian issue, I don't think the Saudis are anywhere near endorsing the Trump plan in its current form, nor do I think they ever would. So I'm not sure that Arab leverage in this case, particularly if Mr. Netanyahu goes ahead with even a soft annexation in July, the Saudis won't object strenuously as they didn't object in opening the US Embassy in Jerusalem, because they still want to maintain ties with the Trump administration. But I don't see much in the way of Arab support for this initiative making much of a difference.
So tied to that, we have a question from Andrew Lieber, who asked, to what extent have Saudi leaders sought to shore up the declining strategic significance of Saudi Arabia to US publics by presenting support for Saudi Arabia as integral to the security of Israel? So sort of as Saudi relevance has declined, are they trying to leverage this possible sort of carrot of Saudi support for the plan?
From the Saudi point of view, I think I don't think that Saudi Arabia is a key player in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict anymore. What is going on inside Saudi Arabia is a kind of distancing from this issue, from this conflict. And there is a very, very strong pulse to send a message that Palestinians are not our problem. Palestinians are the cause of their own problem. And they're using entertainment, the entertainment industry, public culture, television series, visits to Israel to send us, and the press, which is under the control of the government, of course, to send a message saying that this is not our problem anymore. Saudi Arabia for Saudis, we don't want to be involved. And this is the public message. Now, that may be different from what Mohammed bin Salman wants to do. And my guess, having studied Saudi society for years, is that this is a prelude to sending a message to Saudi audiences that whatever happened there is not really our problem. And we see that over Jerusalem, obviously Mohammed bin Salman is closely associated with the Trump-Kushner plan. And the king himself had to appear on television and make some noise, which really didn't change anything. But I don't think Saudi Arabia is the country in the Middle East that is going to be so relevant to any kind of peace between Israel and the Palestinians in 2020. And this trend will continue, I think.
I think American presidents in the past have overestimated Saudi influence in this area. Jimmy Carter told Sadat at Camp David, I've got the Saudis in my pocket, and the Saudis still opposed Camp David. And I think Madawi's right that it's been a fiction for a number of American administrations that if you get the Saudis, they'll bring the Palestinians along. And I just haven't seen it. Aaron knows more about this than I do, but
no,
I
Greg,
think it's
Madawi and Greg, I think, are right on the money on this one.
So another question that came up related to arms sales and, essentially the meetings between Trump and MBS, where Trump held up that great big check of how much money the Saudis are giving to the US by buying these weapons, and just the extent to which altering the US Saudi relationship could potentially endanger this perceived boon that the US receives by selling all these weapons. Does anyone feel, I'm not sure who would be best to address that.
Yeah, I mean, the US is the first provider of these weapons that are put in not very good use, to say the least. But I think the transactional nature of the relationship has become more apparent since Trump was elected and Mohammed bin Salman came to become crown prince. But the problem is, Americans have to ask themselves, are they just like a manufacturing machine to sell arms to dictators around the globe? Or is there anything else that the US could do in addition to selling arms? What we have seen is that every American president sold arms to Saudi Arabia, but sometimes that was conditional. And there was this principle of conditionality, at least the pretense that Americans cared about other things, and they were only going to sell arms to Saudi Arabia if Saudi Arabia respected the rule of law, if Saudi Arabia did some social reform. But at the moment, all these other important questions are completely ignored. And it is basically, a relationship between arms sales and arms dealers. We don't get any kind of intervention in the US that actually highlight some of the domestic issues and policies of Mohammed bin Salman, from the murder of Khashoggi to the repression of all feminist voices, to the religious scholars who are detained. I do remember one case with a Saudi girl. She was dubbed as the Qatif girl, referring to the city where a gang rape took place, and the Saudi judiciary passed the sentence 200 lashes to the girl who was gang raped. And the King Abdullah at the time kept quiet until Hillary Clinton intervened and the lashes were suspended. So basically, we haven't seen since Donald Trump was elected any kind of intervention in that domain. It's completely irrelevant. And it is basically about the armament industry and its capability to sell more arms to Saudi Arabia without any regard to any of these important issues that can improve if there was this principle of conditionality. You don't sell them arms just because they can pay. You sell them arms on condition that certain principles are respected.
Yeah, I'm not sure though, Madawi, watching U.S. foreign policy, not just under this administration, that the issue of conditionality,
absolutely,
with respect to weapons sales has rarely been imposed. I mean, after the fact, for example, when the Israelis in 1981 extended administrative law over the Golan Heights, the Reagan administration suspended temporarily the delivery of F-16s. But there's, you know, this administration has emptied the moral frame of American foreign policy of any ethical or moral content. But I think it would be a severe misjudgment, misleading to suggest that human rights and the projection of American values as a contingency to force our so-called allies to do our bidding has rarely been used as a weapon or a tool to get smaller powers to do what they want. I just want to make one additional point, and Anel and I talked about this at one point. We use the term ally and throw it around in a far too reckless and casual manner. I think an ally needs three ingredients. There has to be a high coincidence of interest, there has to be a high coincidence of values, and there has to be a base of domestic support in a democracy tethered to the fact that we are supporting this country over time because the vast majority of the American public believes that it is in America's national interest to do so. By that standard, Canada's an ally, Britain's an ally, France is an ally, New Zealand's an ally, Australia's an ally. Saudi Arabia is not an ally of the United States. There's no value coincidence whatsoever. There's an episodic coincidence of interests. And Gallup ran a poll in February. For the first time in 3 decades, those who viewed Saudi Arabia as unfavorable or mostly unfavorable was at 65%. And there's a reason for that.
Well, those numbers are even higher after 9/11 for reasons that, you know, I just want to make 3 real quick points on what I think were some excellent interventions here. One, on leverage. I think that if we have leverage on Saudi Arabia, we should use it in Yemen. And to some extent, that's what the Secretary Kerry tried to do at the end of the Obama administration, and unfortunately, I don't think got adequate support from the White House. But also, it seems to me that the conflict in Yemen is now at a point where our leverage, if we were engaged on it, but it would also mean engaging with the Iranians, and that's something that I would be in favor of, but this administration wouldn't. But I think if we have leverage, and we do, I think we should use it on Yemen. Secondly, I completely accept the transactional nature here, but elements of this went beyond transaction, and I think Aaron hinted at this. I mean, the Trump administration embraced Mohammed bin Salman in a way that affected, I would argue, his rise to power within Saudi Arabia itself, right? The dishing out of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, who for a decade, if not more, was America's favorite Saudi, right? Interior minister, he was the security guy. He was who we were cooperating with. I don't think any previous American administration would have, in effect, inserted themselves into family politics in the way the Trump administration did. And I think that the consequences there weren't great. The third thing about arms sales, they're increasingly irrelevant to the way politics works in the region, right? The Iranians have been able to extend their influence in numerous places in the region, not because anybody feared that the Iranian army was going to march across their borders. And the Saudi Air Force is better technically, right, than the Iranian Air Force. The way influence is gained in the region now is through your ability to develop strong relationships with clients and allies and proxies who are fighting for control within the various civil conflicts that exist in the Arab world. And having a lot of arms, having small arms and being able to transfer them to your allies and proxies is great. Having F-15s doesn't seem to really make that much difference.
Yeah, but the Saudis don't actually get this new scenario of how to spread your influence cheaply across the region. And this is exactly what Iran has done with, different militia groups from Lebanon to Iraq and even to the Palestinian areas. But the Saudis think that, you need to have these weapons that are only provided by the US. And they're not willing to understand, although they tried. I mean, if you look at Al-Qaeda, you look at the radical groups that they supported, these are important non-state actors that they had supported. They had pushed to pursue a certain foreign policy in Afghanistan, for example. So they are capable of using the sort of cheap option, but their cheap option turned against them. I'm yet to see an Iranian militia such as Hezbollah, to turn against its sponsors, whereas the ones that Saudi Arabia had sponsored with their lethal radical ideology, they're not interested in creating a civil society, transforming themselves, moving into election, forming a government. All they're interested is a jihadi project that turned against Saudi Arabia, its own sponsors. And therefore, it's a lack of understanding of how you could project your influence abroad. You could establish some kind of hegemony somewhere. And they thought it is only by buying very, very expensive American weapons that they used in Yemen in order to train the Saudi army, and that all the spending on these arms didn't secure them they didn't guarantee any kind of success apart from the death of thousands of Yemenis on the ground.
I mean, you do have to wonder, with the fourth largest military budget in the world, what has been the purpose of billions of dollars in arms sales to a country that cannot possibly, to this day, as Donald Trump, I think, put it in a phone call, either with Salman or MBS, simply cannot defend itself. And I think Greg makes a powerful point. With very little investment, every time the Saudis pop off a Patriot missile to intercept a Scud, it's $1 million. I mean, it's extraordinary to me. And then the vulnerability are drones and cruise missile-like strikes against oil facilities. So I'm still adrift here in trying to figure out what is the logic, what has been the logic. Now you have interoperability, and in 1991, the Saudis proved to be an enormous advantage when Saddam invaded Kuwait. But I don't think, and I'd be interested in Madawi and Greg's view on this, that the stability of the kingdom is tethered to an external confrontation with another power. If there's a legitimacy internal instability problem or stability problem, it may well come from within.
The biggest problem for all the countries, all the regimes in the Middle East, is internal, not external. We haven't had an external war in the Middle East, at least one begun by a Middle Eastern actor, since Saddam. a state-to-state conflict since Saddam invaded Kuwait. And we've had the United States invade Iraq, and we've had the Israelis fight against non-state actors like Hezbollah. We've had the fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Iraq. But the state-to-state war among Middle East countries is something that we haven't seen for a couple of decades. But I do think, look, I think these arms sales have always been an insurance policy, right? And the insurance policy worked in 1990-91. I think that that's the perspective of the Saudi leadership. And you don't change things that have worked. But I think Madawi's point that the new leadership in Saudi Arabia seems to be much more interested in using these weapons themselves. I think previous Saudi leaders weren't particularly interested in using those weapons themselves. They were literally an insurance policy, and you always hope when you buy an insurance policy on your house, you never have to use it, right? But it's other people who are going to come in if your house burns down. And I think that was the thinking of previous Saudi leaders. But the current Saudi leader is more ambitious in that regard. But I think that it's hard to see a success, right? It's hard to see a success in the foreign policy realm for MBS. And I wonder if this wouldn't be the time for the United States, with the Trump administration's relationship with MBS, to just have a conversation about the limits of Saudi power.
I think that ties in well. We've gotten some questions about Iran, about the current U.S. posture, views Iran as the main threat, and that is a big part of why the U.S. and Saudi interests continue to align despite other changing circumstances. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, and I think Madawi was bringing this up already. There's sort of this assumption that Iran contributes to instability in the region, and yet at the same time, we also see Saudi Arabia pursuing many policies that contribute to instability. And so from my perspective, a future administration or the future of the region would probably be better served by acknowledging that Iran exists and trying to work to incorporate Iran into the regional politics in a way that it is not seen as this sort of pariah actor. And that gets a little bit to Greg's point about the fact that there have not actually been wars between countries, and that the Iranian regime in fact benefits from being able to sort of say that everyone's against them and to sort of maintain their own internal legitimacy as a result of this external antagonism, such that the hardliners might be disempowered by being able to be more integrated into the regional system.
I mean, I would only say that, the U.S. is stuck in a broken, angry, and dysfunctional Middle East. It can't transform the region, see Iraq and Afghanistan, and it can't extricate itself from it. So the middle ground here is a much smarter policy, which doesn't tether itself, in the case of Saudi Arabia, to a paradigm which buys into every Saudi argument about Tehran. And I want to make it unmistakably clear. Iranians are serial human rights abusers. Other than China, they execute more people, I think, than any other country in the world. They are interested, the Revolutionary Guard in particular, in creating zones of influence, both defensive and offensive in the region. But I think we've stripped away any flexibility and maneuverability by tethering ourselves to this narrative. And I think we do need to at least test the proposition in a serious way that in fact we can create, I don't know, call it a relationship. I think is from the supreme leader's perspective, using the United States in an adversarial manner leads to national mobilization and concentration of power. I think it's very functional strategy on his point. But nonetheless, we could have a lot more flexibility. I mean, look at the Russians. The Russians talk to everybody. Putin's met with Netanyahu 14 times. We are denied flexibility and advantage because we convince ourselves, and in the case of the Trump administration, their strategy of weakening Iran economically, may be working, but the question is toward what end? What's the point of maximum pressure? to topple the regime, to bring it back to the negotiating table, to negotiate a new JCPOA. I think all of it is fantastical. So I think one of the things that could be done, and it will not be done by this administration, certainly not in the next 6 months, not in the middle of a pandemic, and not when everything is tethered to politics, would be to test the proposition that in fact there is some coincidence of interest between the United States and the Islamic Republic. I think the Saudis, frankly, more or less assume that that may be coming. You get a Biden presidency, that's precisely what you're going to see.
Well, I mean, when we're in any discussion of Iran, I think three things are muddled up. Since 1979, and there were two. First, there's the Iran-US relationship. There's the Saudi-Iran relationship, and more recently is the Iran nuclear program. So I think if we, the Iran nuclear program is a threat to the whole region and possibly beyond the region. But if the relationship between Iran and the US is separated from the relationship from Saudi Arabia and Iran, then we might actually get to a kind of an opening that allows a debate, an open debate. The US has to solve its own problems with Iran. But then Saudi Arabia, if there is a kind of strategic thinking in Riyadh, they would actually look at their own interests and how they could survive with Iran in the same region when they share the same Gulf. And that has to be solved as an independent issue. But at the moment, I mean, since the election of Mr. Trump, all of the three are muddled up. First, there was in the region, people breathed a sigh of relief when the nuclear program was dealt with. Obviously, that didn't appeal to Riyadh simply because they were sidelined and it was done behind their back. But if Saudi Arabia is allowed to discuss its relationship with Iran, regardless of what happens between the US and Iran, I think the region would probably become a safer and better place, at least, or as far as this particular conflict is concerned, in places like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen more recently. But with the current American administration, all the three are messed up, and all the achievement that was accomplished on the more threatening nuclear program was completely, thrown out and disregarded. And the three conflicts are separate, can intellectually and theoretically can be separated. But obviously, politics is not always rational, and it is driven by ideological, grievances and hatreds and vendettas. And this is why, since 1979, there's no solution. It's a stalemate, I think.
So I think Saudi Arabia and Iran have worked out modus vivendi in the past. One can look to the 1980s, or the 1990s, I'm sorry, post-Iran-Iraq war. Not so bad. I mean, they weren't friends, but there were understandings, especially under the Rafsanjani presidency, and to some extent in the Khatami presidency. But I think in terms of stability, we got to remember a couple of things, and this will go down well with the Quincy audience. The biggest disruptor of stability in the Middle East in recent years has been the United States, right? And we should just recognize that, right? And I'm as critical of President Trump as anybody, I think. But President Obama, intervened in Libya. Things were not great in Libya, but I'm not sure that the intervention in Libya brought stability there, right? And of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was breaking open an entire country. Again, things weren't particularly good in Iraq, but I'm not sure that the United States brought stability in there. So I do think that it's time for us to look at the Middle East with more modesty, as Aaron said. We can't remake it. I thought JCPOA was a pretty good deal. And to borrow a phrase, or at least a logic from an earlier Middle East conflict, I think you pursue the JCPOA as if there were no Iranian regional ambitions, and you try to frustrate Iranian regional ambitions as if there were no JCPOA. That's the way the Iranians were going to play the game. And I'm not really sure why we didn't play the game that way either. I mean, I think I know why we didn't play the game that way. But, but we could have gone that way.
Greg makes a fascinating point, and I mean, having worked for almost 25 years loyally and fervently on promoting interests that I believe were in the interest of the Republic, I've spent the last 17 years since leaving government looking back and trying to figure out what we did wrong. And my conclusion, in part, is that we're like some modern day Gulliver, wandering around in a region we don't understand, tied up by smaller and larger powers whose interests only episodically coincide with ours, and tied up otherwise by our own illusions. And until we detach ourselves and look at this region to try to figure out what makes sense for American interests, factoring in politics. I mean, you can't have a foreign policy in this country without a sustainable domestic base. So the notion that somehow politics will be, I don't want the State Department running American foreign policy any more than I want the U.S. Congress running American foreign policy. I want a wise and prudent decision maker in the White House who takes into account all the various interests, political, strategic, moral, and then comes out with a policy that actually is tethered to something called the American national interest. And frankly, the last time that happened, and you can all shoot me if you want, was under Bush 41 and James Baker. We have not been admired or respected in this region as much as we were then. And there were imperfections during those 4 years, but it was a foreign policy that made sense. It means we're tied to ends. So I don't know what to think on this one.
I'll put in a plug for George H.W. Bush. I teach at the Bush School of Government.
I know.
And he is our patron and our founder. So I echo Aaron's praise of George H.W. Bush. If you're looking for a master's degree in international affairs, come on down to the Bush School.
Well, so acknowledging that, and myself having previously been at the Baker Institute at Rice, but the circumstances that Secretary Baker and the first Bush faced were very different. And so one question that has come up a couple times has to do with climate change and the notion that the United States, it would be in the interest of the entire world, but directly in the national interest of the United States to stop tying our foreign policy so closely to the burning of fossil fuels. Obviously, this is also something Saudi Arabia is thinking a lot about. I know that they are talking about moving more towards petrochemicals, towards plastics, knowing that the world itself is also moving away from the burning of fossil fuels. But I just wonder if anyone would like to comment on that, and specifically how the US, and perhaps on the theme of Baker and of sort of reimagining a different world moving forward. So the US helped to forge the post-Cold War global institutions that have governed us since, and that the US, in my view, would do well to sort of take the lead on trying to envision a post-fossil fuel global economy.
I mean, I think there's a lot we can do on climate change that we haven't done. It's a long-term proposition. We're late to the game. It needs to be a central focus of any Republican or Democrat foreign policy and domestic policy. But here we are, and I don't think there's been one mention. We've been going now for 50 minutes. There's been not a single mention, even though we're all here on Zoom, of the fact that we're all trapped right now in probably the most consequential event since the end of the Second World War. It's a global pandemic. And what I think my takeaway from this is clear. We spent $60 billion over the course of the last 20 years on counterterrorism and the threat that jihadi transnational ideology posed to the continental United States, and I'm not here to deny that threat, but if you take out Pensacola, there's not been a single attack directed by a foreign terrorist organization against the continental United States since 9/11. And we spent probably $2 billion, even though intelligence agencies and the public health establishment was warned repeatedly. Look at the National Threat Assessment, 2017, 18, 19, and even this year, which the administration won't allow to be presented to Congress. It says clear as day that one of the great threats is a viral flu-like pandemic that would destroy the American economy and sicken, if not kill, thousands of Americans. So while we're digging out of this plague, we need to rethink what Homeland Security really means for the United States. And to your point, Anel, that includes a much more far-reaching approach on climate. Sorry to drone on, but it just, the madness of it all, just, I can't get over it.
No, that point is well taken. You know, we are all stuck here at home. One issue, well, I know we're starting to get low on time, but one issue that has come up repeatedly in the questions does get to, you mentioned the Pensacola shooting that happened in December of last year. And just the extent to which, you know, a lot of Americans are frustrated at the role Saudi Arabia is seen to have, was proven to have played by the slip up from the FBI releasing the connection between the Saudi embassy and the 9/11 attacks. But just, you know, the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia persists despite acts of violence carried out either with support or knowledge of Saudi Arabia. So I think there's been questions about how is it that there have been no consequences for that.
I have to push back on that. I don't see any evidence whatsoever, including in what came out, that the Saudi government had any foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks. That's been the conclusion of the 9/11 Commission and the subsequent FBI investigations.
But that an official in the Saudi embassy was helping.
That he had a contact with them. And I don't know if that was cognizant of the attacks, and that doesn't necessarily come back. I think we have to focus on the real issues here, right? And it's not that the Saudi government was somehow behind 9/11. It's the issue of the promotion of a radical xenophobic notion of Islam that I would argue, and others might disagree, that the Saudis lost control of. I think they lost control of it in Afghanistan in the jihad against the Soviet Union. And then the question is, have the Saudis done enough to help on the intelligence side, and have they ratcheted down their support for these kinds of ideas around the Muslim world to the extent that they've been more help than hindrance in the post 9/11 world? I would make the case that I think they have, but I understand others would feel differently. But I don't think that we should focus this on, frankly, I think discredited notions that somehow the Saudi government had foreknowledge of the 9/11 attack.
No, and I don't want to say the Saudi government was responsible, but I think there's a widespread perception of the closeness of the U.S. government to the Saudi government is seen, has gotten pushback from Congress, obviously following the murder of Khashoggi, the war on Yemen. Congress has repeatedly tried to push back, and Trump has continued to veto this.
And I accept that completely. I don't think that it had much to do with 9/11. I don't think it had much to do with jihadists, but I think it had a lot to do with the way on both the Saudi side and the Trump administration side, they made a partisan issue of the Saudi-US relationship, which was never popular, never had a strong popular base in the United States, but it had a strong elite base. Democratic presidents and Republican presidents thought that they needed to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. We can argue about whether they were right or wrong. But I think that one of the things the Saudis have done in their very public embrace of President Trump, and their rather public disdain for President Obama at the end, is to increase the partisanship. Everything in America is more partisan now. but increase the partisanship of the Saudi-US relationship. And I think that they're going to regret that.
Well, Anel, I think Aaron made a very good point at the beginning when he tried to define what an ally is. Well, you have a leadership disconnected from its social political base in Saudi Arabia. There's no way of the Saudi leadership reflecting the sentiments, the desires, etc. of Saudis. But at the same time, you could just imagine if an ally doesn't have the constituency that supports your values, shares something with you, they don't have to be a mirror of yourself, but in a way there is a common sort of way of thinking, a common way of expressing disagreement, then yes, the relationship might endure between Saudi Arabia and the US. But what we have seen, 9/11, the latest attack in Florida, all of these are just a result of that contradiction that Aaron talked about. And to think that what happened in 9/11 or in Florida after Afghanistan is that Saudi Arabia lost control, I'm not sure I would use the word lost control, because they are still pretty in control in Saudi Arabia. And when they want, they can activate all that jihadi, radical message that you mentioned, Greg. To just give you an example, in the war in Yemen, everybody thought that the Wahhabi tradition now is moving towards a moderate Islam. And on the frontier with Yemen, you have religious scholars recruited by the army to go and call that war a jihad against the infidels, meaning the Zaydi Houthis who are Muslim. And when the attacks in Abqaiq, at every single opportunity, that radical religious discourse erupts under the umbrella of the government. So I do not think that they have lost control. They still have their candidates, and they can unleash it any minute on the whole of the jihadi project was sort of experienced a turn and became sectarian. So instead of the far enemy, which was the US in 9/11, now it is the Shia, for example, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, and in Yemen. And it is not that the government has lost control. In fact, the government keeps the lid on it. And when it suits its own interest, they are capable of uncovering that lid. And we heard it. It has been documented in the war on Yemen, when the Houthis are dehumanized as the non-Muslims, not only the other Muslims. It is the Muslims who are the people who are outside the realm of Islam. And this is done with the sanctions of the government to mobilize people to support a war against, and it's not even called a war, it is called a jihad against the infidel Houthis. So basically, this is an issue that will continue to erupt. Probably now with the corona, with the epidemic, we're not seeing it, but it is there. And the government in Saudi Arabia doesn't lose control. In fact, it's just covers it up for a while, and it erupts again when it suits it. The only problem with that is sometimes there is an embarrassment. But you could just imagine if another country had sent those attackers during 9/11 or in Florida, the attack, how would the American administration reacted to that? Imagine if they were Iranian or Libyan or Iraqi or any other country. So there is something seriously wrong with the American administration's thinking about Saudi Arabia, that it is willing to go as far as covering up the crimes that are committed on American soil and not allowing a full investigation and an open debate. And that is an American problem. If Saudi Arabia seemed to be getting away with murder in America.
Well, we're going to have to give you the last word on that. We are quite out of time. I'm going to have to thank all of the panelists. This is clearly an issue we could have continued to discuss for hours, but we just have just an hour today. So I'm going to pass it over to Trita to wrap up. But thank you all so much. This has been really, truly fascinating. And I thank you all for your expertise.
Thank you, Anil.
Thank you so much, Anel, and thank you, Aaron, Greg, and Madhavi for a fantastic conversation. If anything, I think it does show that there's a growing consensus that this is a highly unhealthy relationship. Things need to change, but exactly how to change it seems to be a bit trickier, which perhaps in and of itself is a function of the fact that the United States itself, as I think Aaron has pointed to, is increasingly unclear, if not confused, by what its own interest in the Middle East is right now. But this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And thank you to the audience. We had more than, I think, roughly 350 people joining in us today. And before I let you go, let me just quickly let you know about a couple of upcoming events we have. In just a few hours at 8 o'clock, we will be having a conversation about the U.S. South Korean relationship, particularly in light of the recent parliamentary elections in South Korea. On June 4th, we will have a panel on an assessment of Trump's maximum pressure strategy against Iran at the 2-year mark, which has now been in place. It's a conversation that will be with Jared Blanc, with Barry Posen, and Negar Mortazavi. Also on June 11th, we have a panel on QI's new report, which I think actually Aaron kind of pointed to a couple of things that comes out of that report, which it's called 19 Years Later, How to Wind Down the War on Terror. It's been authored by Steve Simon and Richard Sokolsky. Panelists will include Steve Simon, Ambassador Daniel Benjamin, Dr. Karen Greenberg, and New York Times' Eric Schmidt will be moderating that panel on June 11th. If you haven't already, please go to quincyinst.org and join our mailing list so you will get notifications of all of these different discussions that we're having, as well as our publications. And if I don't see you next week, I hope I see you tonight at 8 o'clock talking about the U.S. South Korea relationship. Thank you so much.
Thank you.